They called me a burden, a useless old man taking up space at the family reunion. But when my grandson Jason laughed as I struggled in those deadly waters, he had no idea he was watching a former Navy SEAL who had saved hundreds of lives in seas far more dangerous than these. The morning sun cast long shadows across the beach house deck where I sat with my coffee, watching the waves roll in with the practiced eye of someone who had spent 30 years reading the ocean's moods. My family bustled around me, packing coolers and beach chairs, their voices carrying that particular tone people use when they think you can't hear them properly anymore. Before I share what happened that day, I want to know you're here with me. Just say listening in the comments or let me know where you are listening from. These stories need witnesses, and I'm grateful you're mine today. The beach house rental had been my son Michael's idea, a way to bring the whole family together for what everyone assumed might be my last summer. At 72, with my trembling hands and the way I moved carefully from room to room, they saw an old man counting his final days. They saw the medical bills piling up, the medications lined up on the kitchen counter like tiny white soldiers, the way I sometimes stared out at the ocean with what they mistook for confusion, but was actually recognition. This coastline held memories they couldn't imagine, waters where I had pulled drowning souls from the grip of death itself, but to them I was just Grandpa Harold, the expensive burden who needed help opening pickle jars. Jason, my 16-year-old grandson, had been particularly vocal about the inconvenience of my presence. I heard him on the phone with his friends the night before, his voice carrying through the thin walls of the beach house with that careless cruelty that only teenagers can perfect. "Why do we have to bring him?" he had complained to someone on the other end. "He just sits there drooling and staring at nothing. My mom says we might have to put him in a home soon anyway, so why waste money on this stupid beach trip?" His laughter cut through me then, but not with pain. With something else entirely. With the recognition of a challenge I hadn't faced in years. The morning of the incident started like any other family beach day, with the organized chaos of sunscreen applications and forgotten sandwiches and arguments about who forgot to pack the beach umbrella. My daughter-in-law Sarah moved around me like I was furniture, reaching over my head to grab items from the kitchen counter without acknowledging my presence. Michael, my own son, spoke to me in that loud, slow voice people use with children and the elderly, asking if I needed help walking to the beach as if the short path through the dunes was Mount Everest. I smiled and nodded, playing the role they had assigned me, the grateful old man who appreciated their patience with his failing body. But as we made our way down to the shoreline, something in me stirred awake. The salt air hit my lungs with the force of a reveille call, bringing with it the phantom weight of gear I hadn't worn in decades. My muscles, soft and seemingly weak from years of retirement, remembered a different kind of morning. Dawn operations off carrier decks, helicopter rotors chopping through storm winds, the moment of perfect calm before dropping into chaos to pull someone else's son or daughter from the hungry sea. The ocean spread before us that morning like a living thing, and I read its surface the way other men read newspapers, noting the subtle signs that spoke of currents and dangers my family couldn't even imagine. Jason set up his beach chair as far from mine as possible, making a show of his distaste for my company. He was a handsome kid, tall and athletic like his father had been at that age, with the kind of confidence that comes from never having truly failed at anything. But there was something else in him too, something sharp and mean that worried me. He had his phone out immediately, taking selfies with his friends who had joined us for the day, their laughter bright and careless as they planned their beach activities. I watched him from behind my sunglasses, noting the way he carried himself, the way he looked at the water with the invincibility of youth. The beach was crowded that Saturday morning, families spreading their territories across the sand with the precision of military campaigns. Children ran shrieking toward the waves while parents chased after them with bottles of sunscreen, and teenagers clustered in groups that shifted and reformed like schools of fish. But my attention kept drifting to the water itself, to the patterns I recognized from decades of professional observation. The waves looked innocent enough to untrained eyes, rolling in with that hypnotic rhythm that made beaches feel safe and welcoming. But I could see what others couldn't, the subtle signs that spoke of dangerous currents running beneath the surface like invisible rivers carrying their own deadly agenda. There were warnings posted, small signs that most visitors ignored or dismissed as overly cautious government bureaucracy. Dangerous riptides, they read, swim at your own risk. But warnings mean nothing to people who have never experienced the ocean's power firsthand, who think of water as something that exists for their entertainment rather than as a force that can swallow lives without hesitation. I had pulled too many bodies from these kinds of waters, had felt the desperate grip of drowning hands and the dead weight of those I couldn't save in time, to ever look at any coastline with casual indifference. My family settled into their beach routine with the comfortable predictability of people who had done this many times before. Sarah arranged her magazines and positioned her chair for optimal tanning angles, while Michael immediately began constructing an elaborate sandcastle with the younger grandchildren. Jason and his friends claimed a section of beach closer to the water, their voices growing louder and more boisterous as they tried to impress each other with increasingly ridiculous stunts and jokes. I sat in my chair, apparently dozing behind my sunglasses, but actually watching everything with the kind of attention that had once been my profession. The first sign of trouble came around noon, when the wind shifted and the wave patterns began to change in ways that sent alarm bells through my nervous system. The swells were coming in at a different angle now, creating the conditions that could generate the powerful underwater currents that had claimed so many lives over the years. I shifted in my chair, my hand instinctively reaching for equipment that wasn't there, for the radio that would have connected me to a command center that could coordinate a response. But there was no command center here, no team of trained professionals standing by to execute a rescue operation. There was just an old man in a beach chair, surrounded by a family who saw him as nothing more than a liability. Jason noticed my movement and chose that moment to begin his performance. "Look at Grandpa," he announced loudly enough for his friends to hear, probably having another senior moment. Maybe he forgot where he is again. His friends laughed, that cruel teenage laughter that cuts deeper than they realize, and Jason seemed to feed off their approval like oxygen. "I bet he doesn't even remember our names half the time," he continued, his voice carrying across the sand to where other families couldn't help but overhear. "My mom says his brain is basically gone now, just waiting for his body to catch up." The words should have hurt, and perhaps they would have if I hadn't been watching the water with growing concern. The current patterns were becoming more pronounced, creating the exact conditions I had seen claim lives in waters from California to the Caribbean. But instead of pain at my grandson's cruelty, I felt something else stirring in my chest. Something that had been sleeping for years, but was now stretching awake like a predator that had caught an interesting scent. Jason had no idea what he was mocking, no understanding of the man his words were trying to diminish. He saw weakness where there had once been strength that could pull multiple drowning victims through hurricane swells, saw confusion where there was actually the hyper-alert awareness of someone trained to read danger in a dozen different languages. As the afternoon progressed, the beach grew more crowded and the water conditions continued to deteriorate. I watched families wade deeper into the surf, parents holding the hands of small children who squealed with delight at each wave that washed over their legs. Young couples ventured out past the first sandbar, their attention focused on each other rather than the subtle, but deadly changes happening in the water around them. And, through it all, Jason kept up his commentary, his voice growing bolder and meaner as the day wore on, as if my silence was permission for him to continue his performance for his increasingly uncomfortable friends. But I wasn't silent because I was weak or confused or lost in some fog of age-related decline. I was silent because I was working, my mind automatically cataloging wind speeds and wave intervals and the dozen other factors that determined whether this beach would remain a place of family fun or transform into something much more dangerous. The lifeguards, such as they were, seemed young and inexperienced, more focused on their tans than on the subtle signs that screamed danger to anyone who knew how to read them. Their rescue boards sat unused in the sand, and their attention drifted constantly to their phones and conversations with passing beach visitors. Around 3 in the afternoon, I noticed the first real signs of distress. A middle-aged man about 50 yards offshore was struggling more than he should have been, his swimming stroke becoming labored and panicked as he tried to fight against a current he couldn't see or understand. His wife on the beach was still waving cheerfully, not yet realizing that her husband's playful calls were becoming something more desperate. I started to rise from my chair, then caught myself remembering the role I was supposed to play. Who would listen to the old man anyway? Who would believe that someone they saw as a burden could recognize a developing emergency that trained lifeguards were missing entirely? Jason chose that exact moment to escalate his campaign of humiliation. "Hey, Grandpa," he called out, loud enough to ensure maximum audience participation. "Why don't you go for a swim? Show us some of those moves you're always talking about from the old days." His friends laughed nervously, some of them clearly uncomfortable with how far he was pushing this, but Jason seemed intoxicated by the attention and the power he felt he held over me. "Come on, old man," he continued, his voice taking on a mocking, encouraging tone that made my jaw clench behind my carefully neutral expression. "The water's perfect for someone your age. Nice and gentle." The man offshore was now definitely in trouble, his movements becoming more erratic as the current began to pull him further from shore despite his increasingly frantic efforts to swim back to safety. His wife had stopped waving and was standing now, her hand shading her eyes as she tried to understand why her husband seemed to be getting further away instead of closer. The lifeguards were still oblivious, their attention focused on a volleyball game happening near their station, and the other beachgoers continued their activities with the blissful ignorance of people who trusted that someone else was watching out for their safety. I made my decision in that moment, not because of Jason's taunts, but because of something much deeper and more fundamental than family drama. Somewhere in my chest, beneath the soft flesh and slower reflexes of 7 decades, something that had never really retired was coming fully awake. The part of me that had spent 3 decades pulling people out of situations exactly like this, the part that had trained and prepared and sacrificed everything personal for the ability to be exactly what this moment required. But I also knew that once I stepped out of the role of harmless old man, there would be no going back to the comfortable fiction that my family had built around my supposed decline. Jason was still talking, his voice growing louder and more insistent as he tried to provoke some kind of reaction from me. "What's wrong, Grandpa?" he demanded, suddenly standing up and walking closer to my chair. "Cat got your tongue? Or did you forget how to swim along with everything else?" His friends were definitely uncomfortable now, some of them looking away or muttering suggestions that maybe he should ease up, but Jason seemed beyond hearing anything that didn't feed his cruel performance. "I bet you can't even remember the last time you were in the water," he continued, his voice taking on that particularly vicious tone that teenagers use when they sense weakness and want to probe it like a sore tooth. But the man offshore was running out of time, and his wife was beginning to scream now, her voice cutting across the beach sounds with the pure terror of someone who understood that her entire world was about to change. Other people were starting to notice, turning to look toward the water with the kind of confused concern that comes before real understanding. The lifeguards were finally showing signs of awareness, one of them standing up from his conversation and reaching for a pair of binoculars, but I could see from their body language that they were still trying to assess the situation rather than understanding that assessment time was over and action time had begun. I stood up from my beach chair with the careful deliberation of someone whose body had been dismissed and underestimated by everyone around him. Jason stepped back slightly, perhaps expecting some kind of angry outburst or tearful response to his sustained attack on my dignity. Instead, I began walking toward the water with movements that were no longer careful or hesitant, but carried the purposeful stride of someone who had work to do. My family looked up from their various activities with expressions of confusion and mild alarm, not understanding why the old man was suddenly heading toward the ocean with such obvious intent. Behind me, Jason called out something else, some final attempt at mockery designed to stop me or provoke me or maintain his position as the dominant force in this particular family dynamic. But his words reached me across a distance that was no longer measured in feet but in decades, across the gap between who my family thought I was and who I had always remained beneath the surface. The water was calling to me now with a voice I recognized from 1,000 different operations, and somewhere in the surf ahead of me, a man was drowning while people who should have been trained to save him were still trying to figure out what was happening. The sand beneath my feet changed texture as I approached the waterline, becoming firmer and cooler, and the familiar sensation sent messages through my nervous system that bypassed conscious thought entirely. My muscles began to remember things that my family assumed I had forgotten, and my breathing shifted into patterns that had once carried me through operations in seas that would terrify these weekend beach visitors. Jason was still calling after me, his voice growing more shrill and uncertain as he began to realize that his carefully orchestrated humiliation wasn't producing the results he had expected. I reached the edge of the surf and paused for just a moment, not from hesitation, but from the practiced assessment routine that had kept me alive through 30 years of the most dangerous water rescues the Navy had ever attempted. The current patterns were exactly what I had feared, a classic riptide formation that was pulling the struggling man further offshore while he exhausted himself trying to fight directly against it. In another few minutes, he would go under for the last time, and his wife would become a widow because everyone who should have known better was too slow to recognize what was happening. The first wave washed over my feet with water that was shockingly cold despite the warm afternoon sun, and something in that contact completed a circuit that had been waiting 7 years to close again. I was no longer Harold the burden, Harold the medical expense, Harold the embarrassing old man who couldn't remember things properly. I was Harold Martinez, Senior Chief Petty Officer, United States Navy, Rescue Swimmer First Class, the man they used to call when impossible situations required someone willing to risk everything for complete strangers. Behind me on the beach, my family was beginning to understand that something unprecedented was happening, but they couldn't possibly comprehend what they were about to witness. The moment the cold Pacific water hit my shins, 30 years of muscle memory flooded back like a dam bursting inside my chest. I waded deeper with movements that were no longer the careful shuffling of an old man, but the purposeful advance of someone who belonged in these conditions. The struggling swimmer was about 70 yards out now, his head going under for longer periods as exhaustion overtook his ability to fight the current that was dragging him toward the rocky outcropping that had claimed lives before. My family stood frozen on the beach behind me, their confusion visible even without turning around to look. They had never seen me move like this, with the fluid efficiency that came from decades of training that had never really left my body despite their assumptions about my decline. Sarah called out something about being careful, her voice carrying that patronizing concern reserved for the elderly who wander too close to danger, but her words seemed to come from another world entirely. The water reached my waist, and I felt the familiar tug of the current against my legs. Not the chaotic force that landlubbers experienced, but the predictable hydraulics I had studied and mastered in waters far more dangerous than these. This was nothing compared to the North Atlantic in February, nothing like the hurricane swells off the coast of Puerto Rico, where I had once pulled 6 sailors from a sinking destroyer while 40-foot waves tried to claim us all. But my family didn't know about those operations, had never heard the stories I could have told them about nights when the impossible became routine and heroes were made from ordinary men who refused to let other people die. I dove forward into the next incoming wave and felt my body transform in ways that would have seemed miraculous to anyone watching who thought they knew Harold Martinez. The trembling in my hands disappeared as they cut through the water with strokes that were still precise after all these years, still carrying the power that had once propelled me through conditions that killed stronger men. My breathing fell into the rhythm that had carried me through countless rescues, deep and controlled and perfectly timed to the mechanics of efficient swimming that most people never learned because they never had reason to risk everything in the water. Behind me, I could hear Jason's voice rising in pitch as he realized that his frail grandfather was not only swimming, but moving through the heavy surf with a speed and grace that defied everything he thought he knew about age and ability. "Dude, what the hell?" he was saying to his friends, his earlier cruelty replaced by genuine confusion, and something that might have been the first stirrings of respect. How is he doing that? Where did that come from? But I was no longer thinking about Jason or his mockery or the years of dismissal from a family that had never bothered to ask about the life I had lived before they knew me. I was thinking about Petty Officer Rodriguez, 22 years old and drowning in the Bering Sea after our helicopter had gone down in a storm that the meteorologists said was impossible. I was thinking about the way the water had tried to claim him while I fought through swells that could have swallowed apartment buildings. How his eyes had locked onto mine with that universal expression of someone who understood they were about to die and needed to believe that help was coming. The current was stronger now, trying to pull me off course the way it had pulled countless victims over the years, but I adjusted my angle with the automatic precision that came from understanding water the way other people understood roads. You don't fight a riptide directly, you swim parallel to shore until you find the edge where the current weakens, then you angle back toward your target using the waves themselves to help carry you forward. It was basic rescue swimming, but basic didn't mean easy when you were dealing with conditions that could kill you if you made a single miscalculation. I thought about Commander Walsh, the man who had trained me in the brutal waters off Coronado Beach, who had pushed a young sailor named Harold Martinez beyond every limit he thought he had until swimming in impossible conditions became as natural as walking. The commander had been 63 when I last saw him, still swimming laps that would have exhausted men half his age, still carrying himself with the quiet confidence of someone who had proven his worth in situations where proving your worth meant bringing other people home alive. The struggling swimmer was closer now, maybe 40 yards away, and I could see the panic in his movements as he fought against forces he didn't understand with techniques that were only making his situation worse. He was trying to swim directly back to shore, burning energy at an unsustainable rate while the current pulled him sideways toward the rocks that jutted up from the water like broken teeth. In another few minutes, he would either go under from exhaustion or be swept into those rocks where the impact would finish what the water had started. My lungs felt strong and clear despite the decades since I had last needed them for this kind of work, my body settling into the familiar routine of long-distance rescue swimming with an ease that would have amazed the doctors who had been predicting my decline for years. This was what I had been, what I had always remained beneath the surface that age had laid over my true self like a disguise. I had been the man they called when Navy SEALs needed someone pulled out of water too dangerous for anyone else to enter, the swimmer who had never lost a victim who was still alive when I reached them. Behind me, the beach was erupting in chaos as people began to understand that something extraordinary was happening. The lifeguards were finally moving, grabbing their rescue boards with the frantic energy of people who realized they had missed something important, but they were too far away and too slow to matter now. The man's wife was screaming instructions that the wind carried away, and other swimmers were starting to notice the danger and head back toward shore with the sensible self-preservation of people who knew their limitations. I thought about Lieutenant Morrison, the helicopter pilot who used to joke that he could drop me anywhere in the ocean, and I would find a way to bring everyone home. Morrison had died in a training accident 3 years after I retired, his helicopter going down in conditions that were considered routine, but I had never stopped wondering if I could have made a difference if I had been there. The guilt of retirement, the knowledge that your absence might cost lives, was something they never warned you about when they handed you your discharge papers and thanked you for your service. The water temperature was dropping as I moved into deeper sections where the thermal layers mixed differently. But my body adjusted with the automatic compensation of someone who had trained in Arctic conditions where exposure could kill you faster than drowning. I could feel the current trying to pull me toward the same rocky outcropping that threatened the man I was swimming toward, but I used that force instead of fighting it, angling my approach to use the water's own power to speed my progress. 30 yards now, and I could see the man's face clearly enough to read the terror that comes when someone realizes they are probably going to die, and there is nothing they can do about it. His strokes were becoming weaker and more erratic, his head staying under longer each time a wave passed over him, and I knew from experience that he had maybe 2 minutes left before exhaustion claimed him completely. 2 minutes to cover 30 yards of rough water while fighting a current that had already defeated someone younger and probably stronger than I was. But strength had never been the most important factor in water rescue. Intelligence mattered more, and experience, and the kind of stubborn refusal to accept defeat that had carried me through operations where giving up would have meant watching good people die. I had never given up, Not in 30 years of the most dangerous rescues the Navy had ever attempted, and I wasn't going to start now just because my family thought I was too old to matter anymore. 20 yards, and the man saw me coming. His expression changed from pure terror to confused hope as he tried to understand how someone had reached him so quickly when the lifeguards were still struggling to get their equipment organized back on the beach. He tried to call out something, but the waves washed over his words, and I could see him starting to panic in a different way as he realized that his potential rescuer looked like someone who might need rescuing himself. I thought about all the victims who had looked at me that way over the years, the moment of doubt when they wondered if their salvation was actually just another problem to solve. Young sailors who expected their rescuer to look like an action movie hero, not a middle-aged man with scars and gray hair who moved through lethal water with the casual efficiency of someone going for an evening swim. But looking the part had never mattered as much as being the part, and I had proven that in waters from the Arctic to the tropics, in conditions that ranged from merely dangerous to completely impossible. 15 yards, and I could hear the man's breathing, the labored gasps of someone whose body was shutting down from cold and exhaustion, and the adrenaline crash that comes when you realize you might actually survive something you were certain would kill you. His movements were becoming more coordinated as hope replaced despair, but I could see he was still fighting the current instead of working with it, still burning energy he couldn't afford to waste. I thought about Chief Petty Officer Martinez, the man I had been for 3 decades, who had earned his reputation one impossible rescue at a time until his name became synonymous with bringing people home alive from situations where survival seemed mathematically impossible. That man had never really retired, had just been waiting beneath the surface of an old grandfather who needed help opening pickle jars, waiting for someone to need the things he had spent a lifetime learning to do better than anyone else in the world. 10 yards, and I was close enough to see the confusion in the man's eyes as he tried to reconcile what he was seeing with what seemed possible. This couldn't be the same old man who had been sitting in a beach chair being mocked by his own grandson an hour earlier. This couldn't be someone who needed help walking to the bathroom and couldn't remember where he put his reading glasses. But it was, and as I closed the final distance between us, I felt the familiar satisfaction of being exactly who the situation required me to be. 5 yards, and the man stopped swimming entirely, treading water with what little energy he had left while staring at me with an expression I had seen countless times before. The look of someone who had given up hope and suddenly found it handed back to them by a stranger who appeared out of nowhere when death seemed certain. It was the look that had made every risk worthwhile, every training session in impossible conditions, every time I had pushed my body beyond what seemed humanly possible. I reached him just as his strength finally gave out completely, his body going limp as the water tried to pull him under for the last time. But my hands found him with the automatic precision of someone who had done this exact thing hundreds of times before. And suddenly, he was no longer drowning, but was instead being held by someone who understood exactly how to keep both of them alive in conditions that had seemed hopeless just moments before. The hard part was just beginning, but I was no longer Harold the burden, Harold the embarrassment, Harold the old man who couldn't be trusted to cross the street without supervision. I was Senior Chief Petty Officer Harold Martinez, and I had work to do. The man's weight against my chest was familiar, the dead weight of someone whose body had given up, but whose life could still be saved if you knew what you were doing and moved fast enough. I slipped my arm across his chest in the cross-chest carry that had been drilled into me so many times it was more instinct than technique, angling his body so the waves would work with us instead of against us while I began the careful process of swimming us both back to safety through water that was still trying to kill us both. His breathing was shallow and panicked, the rapid gasps of someone in the early stages of hypothermia and shock, but he was conscious and his heart was still beating strongly enough for me to feel it against my arm. That meant I had reached him in time, that whatever happened next, he would live to see his wife again and go home to whatever life was waiting for him beyond this beach. It was the feeling that had made 30 years of risking my life worthwhile, the knowledge that someone's world would continue because you had been willing to step into the space between life and death and refuse to let death win. The current was still strong, but now I was using it instead of fighting it, angling our path to ride the natural flow of water until I could find the channel that would carry us back toward shore. The man tried to help by kicking his legs, but his movements were uncoordinated and counterproductive, so I spoke to him in the calm, authoritative voice that had guided dozens of panic victims through their worst moments. "Stop moving and let me work," I told him, my voice carrying clearly despite the wind and waves. "You're safe now, just breathe steady and let me get us home." Behind us, I could hear the growing commotion on the beach as more people realized what was happening and began gathering at the water's edge to watch. The lifeguards were finally in the water with their rescue boards, but they were still fighting through the surf that I had already navigated, their technique adequate for normal conditions, but lacking the precision needed for the current emergency. They would arrive eventually, but by then the real work would already be finished by someone they had never seen before and would probably never see again. I thought about all the times I had emerged from impossible rescues to find crowds of people staring at me with the same mixture of disbelief and gratitude that I could feel building on the beach ahead of us. There had been that night off the coast of Alaska when I pulled 3 fishermen from a capsize boat in 20-foot seas, the morning in the Gulf of Mexico when a tourist boat had been swamped by a sudden squall, the dozens of training accidents and real emergencies where someone's life had depended on my ability to reach them before the water claimed them permanently. The man was starting to relax against me as his body temperature stabilized and his breathing became more regular, the natural response of someone whose nervous system was beginning to accept that survival was actually possible. His wife would be watching from the beach now, probably crying with relief and terror as she tried to understand how her husband had been saved by someone who seemed to appear out of nowhere when the trained professionals were still getting organized. It was a story they would tell for the rest of their lives, the day a stranger appeared in their darkest moment and carried them both back to the light. We were maybe 50 yards from shore now, close enough that I could see individual faces in the crowd that had gathered to watch our progress. My family was there in the front row, their expressions ranging from confusion to something approaching awe as they tried to reconcile what they were witnessing with everything they thought they knew about Harold Martinez. Jason stood slightly apart from the others, his earlier cruelty replaced by a stunned silence that spoke louder than any words could have about the magnitude of his miscalculation. The waves were getting smaller as we approached the beach, the water becoming clearer and warmer as we moved into the shallows where children normally played and parents worried about nothing more dangerous than sunburn. But the man in my arms was still trembling from cold and shock, his body processing the reality that he had been minutes away from death before someone had appeared to pull him back from that edge. I kept talking to him in low, reassuring tones, the same voice I had used with countless victims over the years, letting him know that the worst was over and he was going to be fine. The first lifeguard reached us just as my feet touched bottom, his rescue board bumping against my shoulder as he tried to figure out how to insert himself into a situation that was already under control. He was young, maybe 25, with the kind of fitness that comes from gym workouts rather than real-world application, and I could see in his eyes the confusion of someone who had been trained for emergencies, but had never actually faced one that mattered. "Sir," he said, reaching for the victim with hands that shook slightly from adrenaline, "let us take over from here." But the man I had rescued grabbed my arm with surprising strength, his fingers digging into my skin with the desperate grip of someone who didn't want to be separated from the person who had saved his life. "Don't leave me," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the sound of waves and gathering crowd. "Please don't leave me." It was a request I had heard before, the natural response of someone whose survival had become tied to a specific person in a moment of absolute vulnerability, and I squeezed his shoulder reassuringly while helping transfer him to the lifeguard's board. "You're going to be fine," I told him, looking directly into his eyes with the authority of someone who had guided others through their worst moments countless times before. "Your wife is waiting for you on the beach, and you're going to go home tonight and hold her and remember how much you love being alive." The lifeguard looked at me with growing curiosity, clearly wondering who I was and where I had come from, but there would be time for explanations later. Right now, the important thing was getting the victim to shore and making sure his recovery continued smoothly. As we waded toward the beach together, I became aware of the crowd that had gathered to watch our approach. Word had spread quickly that something extraordinary was happening, and people were pointing and whispering as they tried to understand what they had witnessed. A few had their phones out, recording video that would probably end up on social media with captions about mysterious heroes and miraculous rescues. But most were simply staring with the fascination that comes when ordinary people witness something that challenges their assumptions about what is possible. My family stood at the front of the crowd, their faces showing every stage of shock and disbelief as they processed what they had seen. Sarah had her hand over her mouth, her eyes wide with the expression of someone whose understanding of reality had just been fundamentally altered. Michael was shaking his head slowly, his lips moving as if he was trying to work through the logical impossibility of what his father had just accomplished. But it was Jason's face that held my attention, the teenager who had spent the morning mocking my weakness now staring at me with something approaching terror as he realized the magnitude of his mistake. The beach erupted in applause as we reached the shallows, the spontaneous reaction of people who understood they had witnessed something remarkable even if they couldn't quite comprehend the details. The rescued man was conscious and talking now, his color returning as the warmth of shallow water and the proximity of safety completed his recovery. His wife reached us first, splashing into the surf with tears streaming down her face as she threw her arms around her husband with the desperate relief of someone who had thought she was about to become a widow. "Thank you," she sobbed, turning to me with eyes that shone with gratitude and something deeper, the recognition that passes between strangers when one has given the other the most precious gift imaginable. "Thank you for bringing him back to me." I didn't know what to say to that. Had never known what to say when families tried to express their gratitude for doing what seemed like the most natural thing in the world. You don't thank someone for breathing, and I had never been able to understand why people wanted to thank me for refusing to let them drown. The lifeguards were taking charge of the situation now, checking the victim's vital signs and preparing to transport him to the medical station for a more thorough evaluation. He would be fine, I knew from experience, tired and shaken, but fundamentally unharmed by his encounter with the water that had tried to claim him. There would be paperwork and incident reports and probably a trip to the hospital for observation, but he would go home tonight and wake up tomorrow with a renewed appreciation for being alive. That was when I heard the helicopter approaching from the south, the distinctive sound of Coast Guard rotors cutting through the afternoon air with the purposeful rhythm that had once been as familiar to me as my own heartbeat. Someone had called in the emergency, and now the professionals were arriving to take charge of a situation that had already been resolved by an old man who was supposed to be too weak to matter anymore. But as the aircraft circled the beach looking for a place to land, I felt a familiar tightness in my chest that had nothing to do with the physical exertion of the rescue. The helicopter settled onto the hard sand with the practiced precision of a crew that had performed this exact landing hundreds of times before, its rotors whipping up clouds of sand and salt spray that sent beachgoers scrambling for cover. The side doors slid open and 3 figures in orange flight suits jumped out, their movements carrying the efficient urgency of people trained to take control of emergency situations. But as they approached our group, one of them stopped suddenly, his head tilting as he studied my face with the intensity of someone trying to place a half-remembered detail. "Senior Chief Martinez," the man said, his voice carrying clearly despite the background noise of helicopter engines and crowd chatter. His tone held a mixture of disbelief and something approaching reverence that made everyone around us turn to stare. "Is that really you, Senior Chief?" The question hung in the air like a challenge to everything my family thought they knew about reality, and I felt the familiar weight of recognition that had followed me through decades of service in waters around the world. "Commander Thompson," I replied, recognizing the voice even though the face had aged and weathered since our last meeting nearly a decade earlier. The man approaching me had been a young lieutenant then, fresh out of flight school and eager to prove himself in the dangerous business of maritime rescue. Now he wore the insignia of a full commander, his bearing showing the confidence that came from years of leading men and women in situations where leadership meant the difference between life and death. "Holy hell," Thompson said, his professional composure cracking as he reached out to shake my hand with the grip of someone greeting a legend. "I thought you were dead. Everyone thought you were dead after you disappeared from the reunion circuit. What are you doing here? How did you?" He gestured toward the rescue scene, his question trailing off as he tried to process the impossibility of finding one of the Navy's most decorated rescue swimmers pulling victims from a civilian beach, like some kind of mythical guardian. The crowd around us had gone completely silent, their attention focused on this exchange between two men whose conversation was revealing layers of meaning that transformed everything they thought they understood about what had just happened. My family looked like they were watching a movie in a foreign language, their faces showing the confusion of people who were hearing familiar words arranged in patterns that made no sense according to their understanding of the world. Commander Thompson turned to address the gathered crowd, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to briefing rooms full of military personnel and government officials. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced, his tone formal but clearly excited, "you have just witnessed a rescue performed by Senior Chief Petty Officer Harold Martinez, the most decorated rescue swimmer in United States Navy history. This man has saved more lives in more impossible conditions than anyone else who has ever worn the uniform." The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the sound of waves and the distant cry of seabirds as everyone processed what they had just heard. My grandson Jason stood frozen in the front row of spectators, his face cycling through expressions of shock and disbelief, and what might have been the first stirrings of understanding about the magnitude of his morning's cruelty. The teenager who had mocked his grandfather's weakness was now learning that he had been taunting one of the most decorated heroes in American military history. "Senior Chief Martinez holds the Navy Cross for Valor," Thompson continued, his voice growing stronger as he warmed to his subject. "3 silver stars, 5 bronze stars with V device for valor in combat. He's credited with over 400 successful rescues in conditions that would kill most people just for attempting them. We used to call him the Ghost because he would appear out of nowhere when people needed him most, then disappear again before anyone could properly thank him." The rescued man struggled to sit up on the lifeguard's board, his eyes wide as he stared at me with new understanding. "You're him," he whispered, his voice filled with awe. "You're the guy they made that documentary about. My brother told me about you, said you were the one they called when Navy SEALs needed saving. He said you once pulled 6 men out of a hurricane in the North Atlantic, that they gave you medals, but you never showed up to receive them." I had forgotten about the documentary, the unauthorized film that had been made about my career without my cooperation or consent. It had aired on the military channel years after my retirement, using interviews with people I had rescued and commanders I had served under to piece together a story I had never been interested in telling myself. My family had never mentioned seeing it, had never asked about the life I had lived before they knew me, and I had assumed it had vanished into the endless stream of forgotten television content. Jason stepped forward from the crowd, his earlier bravado completely gone as he approached me with movements that seemed uncertain and somehow smaller than they had been just hours before. "Grandpa," he said, his voice cracking slightly as he tried to find words for something that had no adequate expression. "I didn't know. I'm sorry, I didn't know who you were." The apology hung between us like a bridge across years of dismissal and mockery, and I could see in his eyes the genuine remorse of someone who understood that their cruelty had been directed at someone who deserved the exact opposite. I looked at my grandson for a long moment, this young man who had spent the morning trying to diminish me and was now learning that he had been attacking someone whose life story read like a collection of impossible adventures. But I felt no anger toward him, no desire for revenge or vindication that would make him suffer for his ignorance. Instead, I felt the same protective instinct that had driven me into dangerous water to save strangers, the understanding that young people make mistakes because they don't yet know how the world really works. "You couldn't have known," I told him, reaching out to put my hand on his shoulder with the same gentleness I had used with countless victims over the years. "I never told any of you about that part of my life because it was over, and I wanted to just be your grandfather, not some guy with old war stories and faded glory. But maybe I was wrong to keep it all hidden. Maybe family should know who you really are, even if you think that person doesn't matter anymore." Commander Thompson was organizing his team to assist with the victims' transport to the hospital, but he kept glancing back at me with the expression of someone who had encountered a ghost from his professional past. Before he left, he approached me one more time, pulling out his phone to take a picture that I knew would end up in Coast Guard command centers around the world within hours. "Sir," he said, his voice carrying the respect of one warrior addressing another, "it's an honor to see you back in the water. The service misses men like you." As the helicopter lifted off with the rescued man safely aboard, the crowd on the beach began to disperse. People drifting back to their interrupted vacation activities with the slightly dazed expressions of those who had witnessed something that would become a story they told for years. But my family remained clustered around me, their faces showing the struggle of people trying to integrate new information that contradicted everything they thought they knew about someone they had lived with for years. Sarah was the first to speak, her voice quiet and wondering as she looked at me with eyes that seemed to be seeing me for the first time. "Harold," she said, using my name instead of the dismissive dad or grandpa that had become her default mode of address. "How could you never tell us? How could you let us think?" She stopped, unable to finish the sentence that would have forced her to confront the cruelty of their treatment over the years. "Because it didn't matter," I said simply, and I meant it. "What I used to be didn't change what I am now, an old man who loves his family and wants to spend his remaining time being useful to the people who matter most to him. I never needed you to know about the medals or the rescues or the documentary. I just needed you to know that I'm here and I care about you, and I'm not ready to be invisible yet." Michael stepped closer, his face showing the complex emotions of a son who was realizing he had fundamentally misunderstood his own father. "Dad," he said, his voice thick with something that might have been regret or shame or simply the overwhelming confusion of having your world turned upside down in the space of an afternoon. "We've been so wrong about everything. We thought you were, we didn't understand that you were still me," I finished for him, because that was what mattered most in this moment of recognition and rebuilding. "Still the same person who changed your diapers and taught you to ride a bicycle and worried about you every day of your life. The fact that I used to jump out of helicopters into hurricane seas doesn't change any of that. It just means I'm a little harder to kill than you thought." Jason was still standing slightly apart from the group, his face showing the particular anguish of someone who understood that their actions had been not just cruel, but spectacularly misguided. The boy who had mocked his grandfather's weakness that morning was now processing the reality that he had been taunting someone whose courage and competence were literally legendary. It was a hard lesson, but perhaps a necessary one for a young man who needed to learn that strength came in many forms and wisdom often wore the disguise of age. As we walked back toward our beach setup, I felt lighter than I had in years, not because of the physical exertion or the successful rescue, but because of the weight that had been lifted from years of pretending to be less than I was. My family moved around me differently now, with a respect that felt genuine rather than obligatory, their conversations including me instead of talking around me as if I were furniture that occasionally needed attention. The afternoon sun was beginning to sink toward the horizon, painting the ocean in shades of gold and orange that reminded me of other sunsets watched from the decks of Navy ships in waters around the world. But this sunset was different, watched from a beach surrounded by family who finally understood that the old man they had dismissed as a burden was actually someone whose life had been spent in service to others, whose strength had never really diminished, but had simply been waiting for the right moment to emerge again. That evening, as we packed up our beach equipment and prepared to return to the house, Jason approached me with the careful movements of someone who wanted to make amends, but wasn't sure how to begin. "Grandpa," he said, his voice carrying none of the mockery that had characterized his morning performance. "Will you tell me about it sometime? About what you did in the Navy? I'd like to know who you really are." I looked at my grandson, this young man who was learning one of life's most important lessons about the danger of judging people by their appearance or their current circumstances. Maybe I told him, because some stories are worth sharing with family, especially when that family is ready to listen with respect instead of condescension. But those are stories for another day, when you're ready to understand that heroes don't always look like what you expect them to look like. As we walked back toward the house, I felt the satisfaction that had once come from successful missions completed and lives saved in impossible circumstances. But this satisfaction was different, deeper and more personal, because it involved people I loved learning to see me as someone worthy of their respect. The old man they had dismissed as a burden was gone, replaced by someone they were beginning to understand had always been more than they imagined. The water behind us continued its eternal rhythm against the shore, carrying away the evidence of the day's drama while leaving behind the more important changes that had occurred in the hearts and minds of a family who had learned that strength and heroism could exist in the most unexpected places. Sometimes the greatest rescues happen not in dangerous waters, but in the quiet moments when people discover that someone they thought they knew completely is actually a mystery worth solving.